Is it possible to make a case for God's existence? Some philosophers and theologians would say yes to that question. And one way that they make a case for God's existence is to employ something called the moral argument. In previous episodes, we talked about what the moral argument is, what are some challenges to the moral argument, and then also how we can be confident that the moral argument is sound. And we'd like to continue with that theme today by looking at challenges to the first premise of the moral argument. And I'm joined today by Christian scholar Dr. Travis Campbell to help do that for us. Travis, again, just review the moral argument for our viewers real quickly.
Yes, the moral argument is if God does not exist, then objective moral values and principles do not exist. But objective moral values and principles do exist, therefore God exists.
Okay, so we talked about challenges to the second premise in previous episodes and ways in which we can again show that that premise is sound. What about the first premise? Are there philosophers that challenge the first premise? And if so, what are ways in which we can respond to those challenges?
There are philosophers who respond to the first premise by saying that the proposition, if God does not exist, then objective moral principles and values do not exist. That proposition is not closed under entailment. In other words, one does not lead to the other.
So we could have a universe where there are objective moral values without God's existence.
Yes, and to give an historical example of this, Plato believed that there were these abstract properties that just existed, and they were not in any way, shape, or form anchored in any being or person. However, I will say historically, at least in the modern world, the vast majority of atheists have been relativist. In fact, it's relativism that led them to their atheism and vice versa. So the moment many of your greatest philosophers who were atheists, the moment they became atheists, that was the day they shunned the moral law. So Nietzsche would be a great example of this. The moment he said there is no God, he said that life is meaningless, valueless, and so forth. Sartre said that because God does not exist, there is no goodness in this world. There is no good or bad actions, all just is. And even Richard Dawkins says the world is exactly what we would predict it to be if there is no God. And he says we live in a world where there is no goodness, no evil, and so forth. He's denying the existence of anything like an objective moral principle or value. So historically, the argument is held up. People have felt the pinch of the argument precisely because in the absence of God, it's hard to conceive of a world where these objective principles and duties would exist. This is why J.L. Mackie gave the queerness argument against objective moral principles. Because there's no God, just the idea that these things are floating around out there is bizarre. Intuitively, we tend to think that goodness or justice is a property of a person and not a mere abstract object. And because of that, Plato's vision of a world of just abstract objects floating around out there, not anchored in anything, not only falls prey to some of Aristotle's criticisms, like the third man argument, which we won't get into in this video, but I would just encourage readers to go to Aristotle's Metaphysics and watch how he deals with Plato's philosophy and how he just basically pulls it apart. He says he's offering these abstract objects for no real reason whatsoever. And beyond that, we think that it's just intuitively obvious that when you have moral laws that are imperative in nature, telling you what to do, a person has to be standing behind that law. So I think Ravi Zacharias is correct. If there is a moral law, there must be a moral lawgiver. And so for these and other reasons, I think premise one is almost intuitively obvious. If there is no God, then there are no objective moral principles.